He bought a crumbling house by the creek, its porch sagging, windows shattered, and a silence too heavy to ignore. Richard Hale, a 61-year-old retired realtor, wasn't searching for profit but for peace, and perhaps a way to honor his late father's words. Land remembers those who care for it. But when his loyal German shepherd, Charlie, scratched beneath the old floorboards, they uncovered something extraordinary. A hidden cellar sealed for half a century, filled with forgotten ledgers, lost deeds, and the names of those who once risked everything to shelter others. What began as a simple restoration soon became a fight for truth, faith, and redemption. Some might call it luck. Others would call it God's hand at work. Before we begin this journey, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and tell us where you're watching from. The morning mist curled over Maple Creek like breath on a mirror, and the old wooden house stood silent beneath the pale November sun. Richard Bennett stopped his car at the edge of the gravel path and let the engine die. For a moment, all he could hear was the quiet rush of the creek below, a steady whisper that reminded him of his father's voice, low, patient, always believing that the land could listen back if one stood still long enough. Richard was 62, tall and lean, with the kind of build that still carried traces of the athlete he once was. His salt and pepper hair was combed neatly, though a few strands always fell over his temple. His face, lined but kind, bore a look that came from years of negotiating both properties and people. Decades as a real estate broker in Denver had given him success, a name, and a loneliness he hadn't expected. His wife had left years ago, his only son had moved across the country, and now, with retirement looming, Richard found himself staring at the empty outlines of what used to be his ambition. That was why he had bought this house. Not because it was beautiful, it wasn't. The roof sagged, the shutters hung by rusted hinges, and the porch steps groaned under his weight. But the deed had once belonged to his father, Thomas Bennett, a carpenter who believed that every plank had a story. Richard had lost him 20 years ago to a heart attack during a winter storm. He remembered standing beside the old man's coffin, promising silently that someday he'd come back to finish what his father started, to restore the house by the creek and bring its stories back to life. Now, standing before the peeling door, Richard felt the weight of that promise. He reached out and brushed the flaking paint, and a splinter stuck his finger. It bled slightly. An offering, he thought. "All right, Dad," he murmured. "I'm here." The sound of gravel crunching behind him broke the silence. A small truck pulled up, and a woman stepped out, holding a paper bag. She was in her late 50s, slender but strong-looking, with silver threads running through her chestnut hair tied loosely at the nape. Her face carried that calm, sun-worn grace of someone who had lived through loss but learned to smile again. Her name was Linda Monroe, the owner of Maple Bean Cafe, a cozy little place on Main Street. She had lost her husband 5 years earlier, yet carried herself with the quiet composure of someone who'd made peace with grief. "You must be Mr. Bennett," she said warmly, extending the bag toward him. "Welcome to Maple Creek. Thought you could use some breakfast that isn't from a gas station." He smiled, accepting the bag. "That obvious, huh? Let's just say we don't see many men in city shoes coming out this way." Her tone was light, teasing but kind. "That house has been empty since, well, a long while." Richard gestured toward the porch. "I figured I'd give it another chance." Linda hesitated before stepping onto the first stair, her gaze shifting to the dark windows. "You're brave. Folks around here, well, they don't like talking about this place. They say it keeps its own secrets." He chuckled softly. "I sell houses for a living, Ms. Monroe. Secrets are what make them interesting." Her smile faded just slightly, replaced by something thoughtful, almost wary. "Just be careful when you start fixing it up. Sometimes old walls remember things better left forgotten." She turned to leave, then added, "If you need a real breakfast or someone to talk to, you'll find me at the cafe every morning by 7. As her truck disappeared down the road, Richard watched her taillights fade, realizing how her presence had briefly softened the weight pressing on his chest. For the first time in years, someone had spoken to him not as a client or a broker, but as a man standing alone with his memories. Inside, the house smelled of dust, cedar, and something faintly sweet, perhaps the ghost of his mother's lilac perfume. The air was cold enough to make his breath visible. He ran his fingers along the window frames, tracing initials carved faintly in the wood. TB plus MB, his parents. He smiled. On the kitchen counter lay a small photograph in a cracked frame, his father holding a German shepherd pup by the creek, both staring into the camera. Richard's throat tightened. The pup was the first Charlie, the dog his father had trained as a search companion during local rescues. It had died years before Richard left for college. The name had become almost a family heirloom. Each dog he'd owned since had been named Charlie. The new Charlie was 6 years old now, a handsome German shepherd with a strong build and eyes the color of amber. Smart, loyal, and brave, he had worked as a rescue dog before retiring to become Richard's companion. But due to local quarantine rules, Charlie was still at the county kennel, waiting for his medical clearance to move in. The silence of the house without him felt unnatural. Richard unpacked a few boxes, his movements mechanical. He told himself the solitude was temporary, but the creaks of the floorboards and the sigh of wind through the chimney made him feel watched. That night, after setting up his bed near the window overlooking the creek, he found himself talking softly into the darkness. 10 days, buddy, he whispered, imagining Charlie's familiar gaze. Then it's just you and me again. He woke at dawn to the sound of dripping water. The kitchen faucet leaked, tapping rhythmically into the sink. As he turned it off, he noticed something strange, a small dark stain spreading across the floorboards, near the same spot where his father used to keep his workbench. Kneeling down, he touched it. It wasn't water, it was dust, black and fine, seeping up through the cracks as if the house were breathing. Richard straightened, uneasy. Probably just moisture, he said aloud, though the words didn't convince even him. He stepped back, studying the boards. For a fleeting second, he thought he saw them pulse, rising slightly, then settling again, like the shallow breath of something sleeping beneath. That afternoon, he drove into town for supplies. The locals greeted him politely, but with that small-town reserve that speaks louder than words. At the hardware store, an old man behind the counter, thin, stooped, with watery blue eyes, paused when Richard mentioned the address. Bennett House, you say? His tone held a cautious respect. You best keep that dog close when he comes. That land remembers things. When Richard pressed for details, the man only shook his head. Some stories ain't meant for strangers. They're meant for the creek to carry. He left with a box of nails, some paint samples, and a mind full of crustful questions. That evening, he called the kennel to check on Charlie. The attendant told him the dog was healthy and eager. He won't stop pacing when he hears your name. Richard smiled faintly. Tell him I'm counting the days. Back at the house, the sun had set. He stood on the porch with a mug of coffee, watching the water glint between the trees. He thought of his father again, how the man used to say that every house had a heart, and if you listened long enough, it would tell you what it wanted. Richard listened now. At first there was only the murmur of the creek. Then, beneath it, faintly, a sound like a sigh from inside the walls. He turned, heart pounding, but saw nothing, only the flickering light from the old bulb swinging slightly above the door. And then he noticed it. The front door, which he was sure he had locked, stood slightly ajar, drifting open just enough for the wind to whisper through. "Hello," he called softly, stepping forward. The answer came not in words, but in the slow creak of the floorboards deep inside the house, measured, deliberate, almost human. Richard's breath caught. He set down his cup, reached for the flashlight, and froze. The photograph on the counter, the one of his father and the first Charlie, was now face down. When the 10th day finally arrived, the town's morning was wrapped in a silver fog, and the sound of Maple Creek's water carried faintly across the valley. Richard Bennett parked outside the small brick shelter of the county kennel. Through the wire fence, Charlie was already on his feet, tail beating the air like a flag in the wind. The German shepherd's amber eyes brightened the instant he saw Richard, and his low, excited whine cut straight through the still air. 6 years old and in his prime, Charlie was a striking dog. Broad chest, thick black and tan coat, the right ear slightly torn from an old rescue mission, a reminder of the job he had once done. When the gate opened, Charlie bounded forward and pressed his head against Richard's knee, a low rumble of relief rising from his throat. "Easy, boy," Richard murmured, rubbing the dog's neck. "We're home now." It wasn't just a phrase, it felt like a vow. The drive back to the house was quiet except for the steady rhythm of the wipers and the occasional soft bark from the back seat. Richard spoke aloud as he drove, as if catching Charlie up on the last 10 days of solitude. The creaking walls, the smell of cedar dust, the photograph that had fallen face down. Charlie listened the way dogs do, head tilted, as though each word was a commandment. The moment the door opened, Charlie leapt from the car and raced toward the porch. His nails clicked against the wooden steps, and he disappeared inside before Richard even set the grocery bags down. When Richard followed, he found the dog standing still in the middle of the living room, ears erect, body rigid. "What is it?" Richard asked. Charlie's nose was pressed to a patch of floor just left of the fireplace. He sniffed, then let out a faint growl, a sound halfway between curiosity and warning. The dog lowered his head further, pressing one ear to the wood, tail stiff. Richard crouched beside him, placing a hand on his back. The boards were cool under his palm, but there was a faint vibration, so soft it might have been imagined. "Mice," he said, forcing a smile. Charlie's gaze didn't move. By evening, the house felt different. Charlie paced along the hallway, occasionally stopping at the same spot in the living room, ears twitching toward the floor. When night came, the old boards began their slow chorus, clicks and sighs and faint, hollow knocks that rose from beneath like a heartbeat too deep to locate. Richard sat in his armchair by the fire, whiskey glass untouched, telling himself it was just the cold making the wood expand. Yet as the flames flickered lower, he began to hear a rhythm in the creaks, steady, deliberate, almost like breathing. The next morning, he stopped by Maple Bean Cafe again. Linda Monroe stood behind the counter, her hands dusted with flour, rolling dough for pies. The cafe was warm and smelled of cinnamon and roasted beans, a stark contrast to the chill that clung to Richard's house. Linda looked up, a wisp of silver hair falling across her cheek. "Well, Mr. Bennett," she said with a soft grin, "I'd ask how the house is treating you, but you look like a man who hasn't slept much." Richard chuckled, easing himself onto a stool. "I could swear the floor was breathing last night." Linda paused, knife hovering over a strip of pastry. "You're serious." "I'm sure it's just the cold," he said quickly, but her expression didn't change. She wiped her hands on her apron and leaned forward, lowering her voice. "You ever hear of the Borough Meeting House?" He shook his head. "It was a rumor during Prohibition. They say some of the old houses near the creek were built with hidden cellars, places folks used to gather for more than just liquor. Town meetings, sure, but also things that couldn't be written down. My grandfather told me those walls heard promises and betrayals both. The Bennett place was one of them." "Are you telling me I bought a speakeasy?" She smiled faintly, but there was no humor in it. "I'm telling you that house has history, and history tends to breathe back when you stir it." Before he could reply, a man entered the cafe. He was in his late 60s, tall but stooped, with a face like carved granite. A gray beard framed his jaw, and his eyes were the pale blue of winter lakes, calm but watchful. He wore a thick brown jacket dusted with sawdust and smelled faintly of pine tar. "Morning, Linda," he said, nodding before glancing at Richard. "New face?" "Richard Bennett," Linda introduced. "He bought the old Bennett house." The man's brows lifted. "Ah, you've got your work cut out for you." He extended a calloused hand. "Name's Tom Weaver. I do carpentry around here, fixed more roofs than I can remember, including that house back in '79 after the north wall cracked." Richard shook his hand firmly. "Then maybe you're the man I need. The floor's odd." Tom's gaze sharpened slightly. "Odd how?" "It creaks, and something's under there." The carpenter scratched his beard. "You might want me to take a look. But fair warning, old houses in that valley sit on strange ground. Soft soil, old tunnels. Sometimes you fix one problem and find another that's been waiting 100 years. They arranged for Tom to come by the next morning. As Richard left the cafe, Linda called after him, "If the house starts talking again, don't answer it." Her voice was half teasing, half earnest. That night, Richard sat at his desk, sorting through an old chest he'd found in the hallway closet. Inside were yellowed letters bound with twine. The handwriting was elegant, dated 1923. They spoke of meetings under the oak, crates of bottles marked ink, and something called the Circle of the Creek. One page bore a phrase that stopped him cold: "Keep the room sealed until the rightful hands return." Chill ran through him, though the fireplace burned bright. Charlie stirred at his feet, growling softly, eyes fixed once more on that same patch of floor. Richard set the letter aside and stood, stepping over to the spot. He pressed his foot down. The board gave slightly. Then came the sound again. Tap, 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 tap. 3 knocks, followed by silence. He knelt and pried at the board with the edge of a screwdriver. It didn't move. Beneath his touch, the wood seemed almost to resist him, bending but not breaking. He sat back, exhaling shakily. "Tomorrow," he whispered. "We'll see what Tom says tomorrow." Sleep was no easier. Around midnight, Richard woke to the sound of claws clicking across the floor. He opened his eyes to see Charlie standing at the foot of the bed, staring toward the doorway, hackles raised. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters. Then, just beneath the sound of the storm, came a low, hollow exhale. Not wind through the cracks, not pipes, but something closer, deeper, like the sigh of the house itself. Charlie barked once, sharp and loud, and the noise stopped. Morning came pale and cold. Tom Weaver arrived with a tool belt and a cautious smile. "All right," he said, stepping inside. "Let's see this mysterious floor of yours." His boots thudded across the boards until he reached the spot by the fireplace. He knelt, running a thick hand over the seams. "You weren't wrong," he muttered. "There's something hollow beneath." He fetched a mallet and tapped. The echo that came back was long and deep. "That's no crawl space. That's a room." Richard felt the back of his neck prickle. "A room? Why would anyone—" Tom straightened slowly, wiping dust from his fingers. "During the dry years, people built all kinds of things under their homes, but this one's different, too solid. Whoever built this didn't want it found." Richard opened his mouth to ask more, but Tom had turned toward the wall, tracing faint scratches near the baseboard. "See this?" he said, pointing to a pattern of 3 small cuts forming a triangle. "Old carpenter's mark. I used to see it in barns built by the Monroe family. Linda's grandfather carved those." The room went silent except for the faint creak of settling wood. Richard glanced toward the window where the creek shimmered in the distance, and for an instant he could have sworn he saw movement, like someone walking along the bank, just beyond the trees. When he looked again, there was nothing. Tom began gathering his tools. "I'll bring proper gear tomorrow. If you're planning to open it, you might want someone else around. Some doors don't like being opened alone." Richard nodded numbly, his gaze drifting to the floor where Charlie now sat motionless, ears pinned back, eyes locked on that same spot. The house was quiet again, but in the stillness, Richard could feel it, the faintest tremor underfoot, as if something deep below had just exhaled in relief. The next morning dawned clear but brittle, the kind of cold that made the creek's mist look like breath rising from the earth itself. Richard stood in the living room beside Tom Weaver, both men staring at the floor where Charlie sat tense, tail sweeping the boards in impatient arcs. The German shepherd's amber eyes were locked on the faint seam between 2 planks. His ears flicked, nose twitching, as if sensing a memory trapped beneath the wood. "Go ahead, boy," Richard murmured. Charlie pressed his paw down once, then began to dig furiously, nails raking against the old oak until the dull thunk of metal echoed up. Dust filled the air. One board popped loose, revealing a small brass handle darkened by time. Tom crouched, brushing sawdust away with his thick fingers. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered. He fetched a crowbar, wedged it under the edge, and pried. With a groan, the plank lifted, and a rectangle of shadow opened before them. A rush of cold, stale air rose up, carrying the faint scent of smoke and earth. Beneath, a narrow stone staircase spiraled into darkness. Richard held his breath. "So it's real?" Tom nodded grimly. "More real than I'd like." They fetched lanterns and descended slowly, Charlie leading the way. The steps were slick with damp, and each footfall echoed like a heartbeat inside the stone walls. After a dozen steps, the passage widened into a cavernous room, its ceiling curved like an old cathedral vault. Wooden beams, blackened with age, held up the arch. Dust-covered barrels and crates lined the walls, and a single table stood in the center, beneath a rusted chandelier that swayed faintly, though no air stirred. Tom whistled softly. This was no crawl space. Someone built this to last. Richard swept his light across the room. On one wall hung a faded mural of a river flowing beneath oak trees. Carved letters above read, "Shelter for the honest and the hunted." He moved toward a shelf stacked with ledgers, jars, and tarnished mugs. "Look at this," he said, pulling a notebook free. The handwriting was elegant and slanted, dated 1926. Names filled the pages, families, trades, notes about routes. "It's a record," Richard murmured. "Maybe refugees or workers?" Tom nodded. Back then, the factories brought in men from everywhere, Mexico, Ireland, even down south. They weren't treated kindly. Folks hid them from inspectors. This might have been one of their safe houses. Richard turned another page and froze. Scrawled in bold ink were the words, "Lang Properties, claim denied, Creek deed remained sealed until discovery of proof. Beneath it, a crude map showed a dotted line leading from the house to a small sketch labeled Old Maple Church. Tom leaned over his shoulder. Lang? You mean Howard Lang? The real estate guy buying up half the valley? Richard frowned. Same family. He's the one pushing to develop this land. If that deed's real, it could stop him, Tom finished. They searched further. At the far end of the room stood a rusted safe embedded in the wall. The lock was corroded, but Tom grinned, eyes glinting. Give me a minute. He worked the tumblers with a pick from his belt. After several tense clicks, the door creaked open, releasing a puff of metallic dust. Inside lay a bundle of papers wrapped in oilskin. Richard unfolded it carefully. Official seals, signatures, survey lines. His heart pounded. It's the original land deed for the Creek property, he said hoarsely. Signed 1898. It names the land as community trust. Can't be sold without consent from the descendants. Tom exhaled. Then Lang's development plan is illegal. Before Richard could reply, Charlie let out a low growl. His gaze darted toward a narrow tunnel branching off the main chamber. The lantern light barely reached its end, but faintly, a metal glint flickered inside. Richard stepped closer, and a shiver ran down his spine. The tunnel sloped downward, half collapsed, lined with brick. He crouched, raising the light. There, in the dirt, was an old pocket watch. Its face cracked, hands frozen at 3:17. Beneath it, a small wooden plaque read, "For those who waited." Tom's voice echoed softly behind him. Maybe we shouldn't go farther tonight. These tunnels could run for miles. Reluctantly, Richard nodded. They returned upstairs, carrying the documents and the ledger. As the trapdoor closed, the air in the room seemed to shift, lighter yet restless, like something left unsaid. That afternoon, Richard visited the county records office. Behind the front desk sat Margaret Cole, a meticulous woman in her early 60s with sharp gray eyes behind thin glasses. Her hair, pale gold streaked with white, was wound into a tight bun. Known for her precision, Margaret had worked in the records department for decades and trusted paper more than people. "What brings you here, Mr. Bennett?" she asked, straightening her cardigan. "I need to verify a land deed," Richard replied, sliding the bundle toward her. Margaret adjusted her glasses, scanning the pages. Her brow furrowed. "Where did you find this?" "In the foundation of my property," she hesitated. "You realize this document predates the county's current registry. If it's valid, it changes everything about the Creek zoning." Her tone shifted, cautious now. "Howard Lang won't be pleased." "I'm not here to please him." She looked up at him for a long moment, something like admiration flickering in her eyes. "Then you'd better make copies. Keep the original safe." When Richard returned home, the sun was dipping low, painting the sky in burnt orange. Charlie trotted beside him, tail wagging, but the dog's ears twitched constantly, as if listening for something underground. The house felt alive again, each board humming faintly underfoot. Richard poured himself coffee and sat at the table, spreading the papers out. His thoughts tangled between fear and purpose. His father's words echoed in memory. "Land remembers, son. Treat it like a witness, not a possession." He ran a thumb along the old ink, realizing how literal that truth had become. Just as he began to pack the documents into a drawer, a knock sounded at the door. Standing outside was Howard Lang, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a charcoal suit and black wool coat. His gray hair was slicked back, and his pale eyes held the chill of polished steel. "Mr. Bennett," he said smoothly, smile thin as paper, "I hear you've been doing some renovations." Richard's stomach tightened. "Something like that." Lang stepped closer, his cologne sharp. "Word travels fast in small towns. I'd hate for you to get tangled in matters beyond your expertise." "I'm a realtor, Mr. Lang. Land's my expertise." Lang's smile faltered for half a breath, then returned. "Let's not make enemies where we could make partners. I could offer you triple what you paid for that property, today." Richard folded his arms. "It's not for sale." Lang's eyes darkened, and the mask slipped just enough to reveal the temper beneath. "Careful, Bennett. Some doors are better left closed." With that, he turned and strode toward his black car parked at the gate. The sound of tires crunching gravel lingered long after he'd gone. That night, wind battered the windows. Charlie refused to leave Richard's side, lying with his head on the man's boots. Around midnight, a soft metallic clang echoed from below the floor, followed by another, sharper, as if someone were down there moving the safe. Richard froze, every muscle tense. Charlie rose growling, eyes fixed on the living room floor. He reached for the lantern and whispered, "Stay close." As he lifted the trapdoor, a current of air brushed past his face, cold and deliberate, like something escaping. The stairs yawned below, swallowing the light. "Hello?" he called. No answer, only the faint drip of water and the sound of Charlie's low, trembling growl. Then he saw it. On the table below, the ledger he had left closed now lay open, pages fluttering, though there was no breeze. And across one page, scrawled freshly in black ink, were words that hadn't been there before. "The land remembers." The morning after the strange message appeared in the ledger, the sky hung low and gray, the kind of dull heaviness that pressed on the heart. Richard stood at the window, mug of black coffee cooling in his hands. Outside, tire marks cut across his gravel driveway, leading to the gate now hanging lopsided on its hinges. The wind had a bitter bite, and beyond the creek he could see the faint plume of smoke from someone burning brush. Charlie paced restlessly beside him, nose twitching at the air, tail flicking in short, anxious arcs. The knock came at exactly 9. Howard Lang didn't wait for an invitation. He entered like he owned the threshold, carrying a leather briefcase and that same diplomatic smile that never touched his eyes. Today he wore a dark overcoat with a silk scarf the color of ash. "I hope I'm not interrupting breakfast," he said lightly, placing the briefcase on the table. "I thought we might settle our little misunderstanding before lawyers start earning their keep." Richard said nothing, watching as Lang unclasped the case. He pulled out a checkbook, his movements deliberate, polished, the way men write when they have already decided to win. "Let's be practical," Lang continued. "You found something interesting beneath that charming wreck you live in, and I'm sure you think it's yours. But that document, well, it complicates things. I'm offering you a number that ends those complications. Permanently." He wrote a figure, slid the check across the table, and leaned back. Richard didn't even look down. "That's generous," he said flatly, "but the answer's no." Lang's smile didn't break, but his eyes hardened. "Everyone has a price, Mr. Bennett. Maybe not today, but when the court fees mount, when this little cabin starts to feel like a burden." Richard cut him off. "You don't understand, Lang. This land belonged to people who had nothing but hope. They built something under here, something decent. You're not buying it." Lang's jaw flexed once, the smile collapsing into a thin line. "You're making a mistake." "Maybe," Richard replied, "but at least it's mine to make." Lang stood, adjusted his coat, and left without another word. The sound of his car receding down the dirt road lingered like an insult. Charlie barked once at the door, low and short, as if sensing the tension. By noon, the wind picked up. Richard stepped outside to find his fence toppled, posts broken clean, like something had driven through. A single sheet of paper fluttered against a bush. He caught it before it blew away. The words were scrawled in block letters. "Stop digging, stop talking," or "The creek won't be the only thing buried." He stared at the note until the letters blurred, anger and fear rising together. Charlie pressed against his leg, whining softly, eyes fixed on the horizon. That afternoon, Richard drove into town. At the courthouse, the front clerk handed him a letter stamped in red. The hearing for Maple Creek zoning transfer had been scheduled for 10 days later. "They're moving fast," she said sympathetically. "Lang's lawyers requested an expedited review. You'll need evidence ready." Evidence. That word echoed in his mind as he left the courthouse. The deed, the ledger, the tunnel, they were proof, but he needed legitimacy. Someone to testify, to verify the authenticity. Maybe Linda's grandfather's old stories, or even someone from the Historical Society. The thought gave him a small anchor amid the uncertainty. At dusk, he stopped by Maple Bean Cafe again. Linda Monroe looked up from behind the counter, her gray-blue eyes softening when she saw him. She was dressed in a thick cream sweater, her hair, a silvered chestnut, tied loosely at the nape of her neck. "You look like you've wrestled ghosts," she said gently. "Maybe I have," he answered. She poured him coffee, her movements slow and thoughtful. "The Lang came by this morning," she said after a moment. "Asked questions about you. I told him nothing." Richard frowned. He doesn't like being refused. Linda hesitated, then leaned closer. "My grandfather used to say the Lang family built their fortune by erasing other people's names from maps. Be careful, Richard. The creek doesn't just hold history, it holds grudges. Her words lingered as he drove home under a restless sky. The wind whipped the branches against the windows, and by the time he pulled into the drive, rain had begun to fall in thin, cold sheets. Charlie was uneasy the moment they entered. He sniffed the air, then darted toward the kitchen, barking sharply. "Easy, boy," Richard said, setting down his coat. But then he smelled it, a faint hiss under the rain's patter. Gas. He froze, his pulse spiking. "Charlie, outside!" The dog barked again, then lunged toward the stove, teeth bared, claws scraping the floor. The burner's knob had been turned open, ever so slightly. Richard's hand trembled as he twisted it shut. But as he reached for the window, there was a flicker, an outlet near the counter sparking once, twice, threatening to ignite the trapped fumes. "Go!" he shouted, stumbling back. Charlie lunged forward, knocking into him, just as the socket flared with a sharp blue flash. The current burned out harmlessly against the wet floorboards where coffee had spilled earlier that morning. The smell of burnt wiring filled the room. The explosion that should have happened never came. Richard fell to one knee, coughing, arm around the dog. "Good boy," he whispered hoarsely, burying his face in Charlie's fur. The shepherd's chest rose and fell rapidly, his warm breath grounding Richard back to the moment. Once the danger passed, he stepped outside to clear his lungs, trembling in the cold rain. His mind was a storm of suspicion. Lang's men, the note, the open valve. None of it could be coincidence. He glanced at the creek, its dark surface rippling under the wind. Somewhere in that shifting reflection, he almost thought he saw another face staring back, stern, watchful, protective. Later that night, after the sheriff's inspection, a gruff man named Sheriff Walt Crowley, early 60s, thick-set with weathered skin and a deep, even voice. The verdict was simple. "Could have been an accident," Crowley said, "but it smells like intimidation to me." The sheriff scratched his gray stubble, eyes narrowing. "Lang's got half the county in his pocket, but not everyone. Keep that dog close, Bennett. I'll have a deputy cruise by for a few nights." Crowley left with a handshake that lingered like a quiet promise. Richard locked the doors and sat by the fire with Charlie curled beside him. The flames crackled, and his mind drifted to the hearing, to Lang's smug expression, to the faint scrawl in the ledger. He opened the notebook again, tracing the words, "The land remembers." Beneath it, something new had appeared, barely visible under the lamplight, a faint outline, drawn in ink that shimmered when the firelight flickered. It was a map, the same one as before, but now a second path branched from the tunnel's end toward the church, leading to a spot marked simply with a small symbol, a key. Richard stared at it until the embers dulled to red. Outside, the rain eased into silence. Charlie stirred, lifting his head toward the door. His ears twitched once, then he gave a single low bark, soft but certain, as if to say, "We're not done yet." Richard closed the ledger, exhaled, and murmured, "No, we're not." The creek whispered back through the night, carrying secrets in its dark current. The storm came without warning. By dusk, the sky had thickened into a bruise of gran and violet, thunder rolling in slow, deliberate waves. The trees along Maple Creek bent like penitents before the wind. And the rain came sideways, striking the windows with a force that sounded almost like fists. Richard had been pacing for an hour, the ledger open on the table beside a single lamp. The faint lines of the new map gleamed in the flickering light. He traced them with one trembling finger, the tunnel leading to the church, the key symbol etched at its end. Charlie sat by the door, restless, every sound of the wind setting his ears twitching. The dog's coat was sleek with the sheen of lamplight, his amber eyes bright and alert. "Easy, boy," Richard murmured. "We'll figure it out after the storm." He said it half to the dog, half to himself. There was a knock, sudden, loud, startling against the roar of rain. Richard hesitated, crossing to the door. When he opened it, Linda Monroe stood there, soaked to the bone. Her gray-blue eyes shone beneath a hood of dripping wool. "I had to come," she gasped. "I found something, at the cafe, an old watch that belonged to my grandfather. It has the same engraving as the seal on your deed." "Come in," Richard said quickly, pulling her inside. The room filled with the sharp scent of rain and smoke from the fire. She was shivering, her cheeks pale beneath her damp hair. He fetched a blanket, draping it around her shoulders. "You shouldn't have come out in this weather." "I didn't have a choice," she said, voice trembling but resolute. "I think it's the key your map shows. My grandfather worked with the men who built that tunnel. He hid something important in this." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the pocket watch, its brass casing tarnished, but still gleaming faintly in the light. "There's a compartment inside, but I can't open it." Before Richard could examine it, Charlie barked, a deep, sharp warning sound that rattled the air. The lights flickered once. Then came the crash, a window shattering, glass spraying inward. A bottle rolled across the floor, leaking something that smelled unmistakably of gasoline. "Get down!" Richard shouted, pulling Linda to the ground as the curtains erupted into flame. The fire climbed fast, hungrily devouring the dry drapes and licking across the walls. Smoke thickened, choking. Somewhere behind the roar, footsteps retreated into the storm, the intruder gone as swiftly as he came. "Back door!" Richard coughed, grabbing Linda's hand. But the kitchen doorway was already a sheet of fire. The smoke was dense, clawing at their lungs. Charlie barked again, circling them frantically, then darted toward the living room corner where the trapdoor was hidden. "The tunnel!" Richard rasped, realizing. "Go!" They crawled after him through the dark, visibility nearly gone. Linda stumbled, her voice breaking. I can't see." "Follow his sound," Richard said, barely breathing. "Follow Charlie." The shepherd's bark echoed through the smoke, steady and sure, like a beacon. Richard's fingers found the brass handle at last, warm now, almost burning. He pulled, and the door gave way with a groan. A breath of cold, damp air rushed up from below, cutting through the smoke like salvation. "Go, Linda," he urged. She hesitated, eyes wide with terror, but obeyed, climbing down into the darkness. Then the ceiling above cracked with a sound like thunder splitting the earth. A beam collapsed, striking Richard's shoulder and knocking him aside. The world blurred in smoke and pain. He felt himself sliding toward the flame's edge, and then, teeth at his sleeve, Charlie. The dog had turned back through the fire, jaws clamped on his jacket, pulling with desperate strength. "No," Richard wheezed, trying to push him away. "Go!" But Charlie refused, growling low, dragging him inch by inch toward the open hatch. Heat seared his skin, smoke blinded him. Still, the dog pulled. "Come on," Richard gasped, forcing his body upward. His foot found the first step, then the next. Charlie guided him, nudging his leg, barking once each time he faltered. Step by step, they descended into the cold, the fire roaring above like the breath of some furious god. They reached the bottom. The air was heavy with damp earth, the stone walls glistening with condensation. Linda's lantern flickered in the distance. She ran to him, her face streaked with soot. "Richard!" He leaned against the wall, coughing hard, one arm around Charlie's neck. "He saved me," he croaked. "He went back for me." Linda knelt beside them, eyes wet. "Then he's more human than most men I've known." The tunnels stretched before them, long and low, the map's promise leading them onward. They followed the faint slope downward, past old barrels and collapsed beams, until the air changed. Fresher, cooler. At last, they emerged into a small stone chamber beneath the church, where an old wooden door stood half open. Inside, dust motes drifted in the beam of Linda's lantern. The room was small, no more than 10 feet across, with shelves filled with rusted tools and glass jars. On the table in the center lay an iron box and a single candle, long melted into a lump of wax. Linda approached the box, trembling. "This is where he worked," she whispered. "My grandfather." She placed the pocket watch on the table, twisting its crown. There was a faint click. The back popped open, revealing a tiny roll of film sealed in a glass capsule. Richard's breath caught. "Microfilm," he said, voice low with disbelief. "He hid records." Linda's fingers shook as she lifted it. "These must be the originals," she whispered. "Property transfers, ownership seals. Everything Lang's company faked 50 years ago. My grandfather must have discovered it and hidden the proof." Richard looked down at Charlie, who sat calmly now, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but alert. "You found us the truth, boy," he murmured. "Again." Thunder shook the earth above, a reminder that the storm hadn't passed. Water began to seep through the cracks, running in thin rivulets along the floor. They had to leave soon. But before they did, Linda handed him the capsule. "You keep it," she said. "You're the one they'll listen to." He hesitated, meeting her gaze. There was something different there, trust, quiet and sure, tempered by fear but not broken. "We'll do this together," he said softly. For a moment, the roar of the storm faded. They stood close, two silhouettes framed by the trembling light, the sound of the creek above them, like the pulse of the earth itself. Then Charlie barked once, sharply, as if reminding them the world was still burning. They turned toward the narrow exit behind the altar stairs, the one that led up to the church nave. The wind howled through it, carrying the smell of smoke and rain. Richard looked back once at the chamber, the table, the watch now lying open, its gears glinting faintly. "The land remembers," he whispered again. Then, with Charlie leading the way, they climbed toward the light. Morning broke over Maple Creek with a clarity that felt almost unreal. After weeks of gray skies and rain, the air was crystalline, and the water in the creek glittered like liquid glass under the autumn sun. The storm had passed, but its memory clung to the town. The scent of damp wood, the sight of broken branches strewn across roads, and the echo of something purged, as though the land itself had exhaled after years of holding its breath. Richard stood on the courthouse steps, his reflection caught faintly in the glass doors behind him. He wore a dark gray suit, one that still felt foreign to him after years of work boots and field jackets. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed back, and though there were deep lines at the corners of his eyes, there was a new calm there, a stillness that hadn't existed before. Beside him sat Charlie, perfectly poised, his black and tan coat brushed to a copper sheen. The dog's amber eyes scanned the crowd, as if he, too, understood the gravity of this day. Linda stood nearby, dressed in a soft gray coat with a silver brooch pinned at her collar. The morning light made her pale skin almost luminous. The faint smile she gave him steadied his heart. When the courthouse doors opened, they walked in together, Charlie trotting beside them, tail low but proud. Inside, the courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and paper. Judge Harris, a tall man in his 60s, with a solemn face and a neatly trimmed white beard, sat behind the bench. His voice carried the weight of years and fairness earned. "This session concerns the rightful ownership and preservation of the Maple Creek watershed," he began. "Evidence submitted includes historical property records, witness statements, and photographic documentation." Howard Lang sat on the opposite bench, his once impeccable composure worn thin. The man's square jaw was tense, his gray-flecked hair carefully slicked back, but his cold eyes betrayed exhaustion. He had aged in weeks, not years. Next to him, his attorney, a slick young man named Preston Moore, with expensive glasses and a nervous twitch in his jaw, flipped papers with too much speed, as though motion could erase the inevitability gathering in the air. Richard's attorney, a woman named Margaret Fields, rose first. She was in her early 50s, tall and composed, her auburn hair swept into a low bun. Her calmness carried authority born of principle rather than power. "Your Honor," she began, "the evidence presented demonstrates beyond dispute that the deeds filed by Mr. Lang's development company were falsified 50 years ago by predecessors who knowingly fabricated boundary records. The original documents, preserved on microfilm and verified by the State Archive, prove that this land was designated under the Community Trust Act of 1912. In short, Maple Creek belongs not to one man, but to the town itself." Howard's lawyer tried to object, but the judge silenced him with a glance. The microfilm was displayed on the overhead projector, grainy yet unmistakable. Names appeared, early families, Richard's father among them, and Linda's grandfather. A silent gasp rippled through the gallery. Howard leaned forward, his voice strained. "That land has been abandoned for decades," he snapped. "Unused, forgotten. I turned it into something valuable." "No," Richard said quietly from his seat. The courtroom turned toward him. "You tried to turn it into something profitable. There's a difference." The words hung there, unadorned, but they carried the weight of truth. The judge leaned back, folding his hands. For a long moment, only the faint creak of the ceiling fan could be heard. Then, with measured gravity, Judge Harris spoke. "The court hereby recognizes Maple Creek and its surrounding watershed as protected under the Community Trust Act. Any attempt to purchase or develop this land for private profit is null and void. The property is now officially restored to community stewardship." The gavel fell. The echo was like thunder rolling away over distant hills. Howard Lang sat motionless, his jaw clenched, then stood abruptly and stormed out, Preston stumbling after him. The press surged outside, the murmur of questions filling the air like restless birds. But Richard heard none of it. He turned to Linda, whose eyes shimmered with tears. "It's over," he said softly. She nodded, pressing her hand briefly over his. "No," she whispered, smiling faintly. "It's beginning." Weeks later, the town gathered again. This time not for judgment, but for celebration. Maple Creek's autumn fair had been revived, the streets strung with lights, the smell of apple pie and roasted corn drifting through the air. Richard's house by the creek stood reborn, its once charred walls replaced, the porch restored, the paint a warm cream trimmed with forest green. Behind it bloomed a new garden, rows of roses and herbs, the air fragrant with lavender and mint. Linda stood among the blooms, wearing a light blue dress beneath her cardigan, her hair pinned loosely back. "You did all this yourself?" she asked. "Mostly," Richard said, handing her a small watering can. Though Charlie supervised. At the sound of his name, the shepherd trotted over, tail wagging, nose dusted with a bit of soil. His right ear still bore its small tear, a badge of honor that made children adore him all the more. Linda knelt to stroke his head. "He looks proud of himself." "He should be," Richard replied. "We both owe him our lives." Later that afternoon, the mayor, an elderly woman named Helen Price, with short white hair and sharp wit, took the stage in the town square. The crowd fell quiet as she held up a small bronze medal engraved with the town's emblem. "Today, Maple Creek honors one of its finest citizens," she said. "Not a man, but a hero nonetheless." She gestured toward Charlie, who sat beside Richard at the foot of the stage. "For bravery, loyalty, and service beyond measure, we award Charlie the Medal of Civic Honor." Applause burst forth, echoing down the streets. Children waved small flags. Even the old veterans wiped at their eyes. Richard knelt beside his companion, fastening the medal gently to the dog's collar. "You've earned this more than anyone," he whispered. Charlie tilted his head, then perked his ears as Richard softly called his name. In that moment, the noise of the crowd fading, the banners fluttering above, something unspoken passed between them. It wasn't command or gratitude, but understanding, the same kind that had bound them in the fire, in the dark, when words had no place and trust was everything. After the ceremony, Richard opened the small building beside his home, the one he had spent weeks restoring. Inside, sunlight streamed through tall windows onto displays of old photographs, letters, and maps. At the center, the pocket watch rested in a glass case, its brass gleaming beside a plaque that read, "The Land Remembers." "This is what I promised," he said quietly to Linda, who stood beside him. "A place for memory, for everyone who helped build this town, and for those who'll come after." Linda smiled, "And for those who never stopped believing in it." Outside, the creek murmured softly, carrying the scent of wet earth and roses. The late afternoon sun dipped behind the hills, and the first lights of evening blinked on along the street. Richard looked out across the garden, at Charlie dozing near the porch, the townsfolk laughing beyond the fence, Linda's hand resting lightly in his, and for the first time in years, he felt whole. He turned toward her and said, half smiling, "I was right, you know. The house does breathe." She laughed softly, eyes shining. "Then let's make sure it never stops." The wind rustled through the roses, and somewhere, far off, the creek whispered its endless refrain, a song of loss, rediscovery, and the quiet joy of coming home. Autumn had settled over Maple Creek like a soft, golden sigh. The air was crisp but forgiving. The scent of fallen leaves mingling with wood smoke from the chimneys that dotted the valley. Along the stone path leading down from Richard's porch, maple leaves painted the ground in shades of amber and copper. Beyond the garden, the newly restored Maple Creek Memorial Park stretched along the banks of the creek, where the water murmured like a song too ancient to ever fade. It had been 6 months since the trial. The town had changed, not in its bones, but in its heartbeat. Where once the land had been fenced and forgotten, now children ran freely, their laughter carrying across the water. Volunteers had planted wildflowers along the banks, and a wooden sign carved by a local craftsman read, "Maple Creek Memory Park, a place to remember and begin again." Richard stood by the porch rail, his hands resting on the worn wood. He was dressed casually now, no longer the man who once lived between closing deals and half-empty houses. His olive-brown jacket was flecked with sunlight, his salt and pepper hair ruffled by the wind. He had the look of someone at peace, yet alert, like the land he had fought to protect. Charlie sat beside him, tail sweeping the boards in slow rhythm. His coat gleamed in the afternoon light, and his torn ear twitched at the hum of distant music. The dog's eyes were half closed, listening, as though he knew the melody belonged to this place, to the laughter, the voices, and the gentle rhythm of people rediscovering what mattered. Linda's voice called from the garden. "Richard, could you bring the extra lanterns?" She was kneeling among the rose bushes, arranging vases along the tables set for the evening's event. The garden was now full-grown, alive with color and scent. Linda herself looked changed too. Her once guarded composure had softened. Her brown hair, streaked faintly with silver, caught the sunlight like threads of gold. The months of rebuilding had given her a quiet confidence, and her eyes, those gentle hazel eyes, now held laughter more often than sorrow. Richard brought the lanterns down, their glass panes catching glints of sky. "How many guests do we expect?" "Almost the whole town," she said, smiling as she rose. "Mayor Helen's bringing her grandson's band. Anne Margaret's bringing pies. She said she owes you one for not listening to her about playing it safe." He chuckled. "I'll take that as a compliment." They worked together as the sun dipped lower, setting up chairs near the creek and stringing lights between the trees. It was to be a benefit concert, a fundraiser for the town's preservation fund. The idea had been Linda's, inspired by the same spirit that had built the park. Give back to the land that gave you everything. By the time the first guests arrived, the evening sky was a painting of lavender and rose. The air hummed with music and laughter. Helen Price, the silver-haired mayor, gave a speech short and sharp enough to draw both applause and chuckles. "Let this park remind us," she said, "that some things can't be owned, only cared for." The music began then, a trio of young musicians playing soft folk tunes, their harmonies mingling with the whisper of the creek. Couples swayed gently near the benches, and children chased fireflies along the water's edge. The lights reflected off the ripples, as though the stars themselves had come down to join. Richard moved through the crowd, greeting neighbors, some old faces, some new. An elderly man named George Haskins, once the town's postmaster, shook his hand firmly. "You saved this place, son. My father fished these banks when I was a boy, thought I'd never see them free again." Richard smiled. "It wasn't just me. It was everyone who believed it was worth saving." From a distance, Linda watched him. There was pride in her gaze, but also something tender, something she no longer tried to hide. As twilight deepened, Richard walked toward the creek. Charlie followed, padding silently beside him. The two stopped near the old willow tree, where the ground dipped toward the water. The lanterns reflected in the dog's amber eyes. Richard knelt beside him. "You remember, don't you? This is where we almost lost it all." Charlie tilted his head, as if listening. Richard reached out, scratching behind his ear. "And this is where we found it again." A breeze swept through the reeds, carrying the faint strains of a love song from the concert stage. It wasn't loud, but it found its way to every corner of the park, slow, wistful, full of promise. Linda approached quietly, carrying 2 cups of warm cider. "You disappeared," she said softly, handing him one. "Just came to make sure he wasn't guarding the creek from ghosts." Charlie gave a low, approving woof, as if to confirm his eternal watch. Linda laughed, sitting down beside Richard on the grass. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the water move beneath the starlight. "Do you ever think," she said finally, "that maybe the land was waiting for us to slow down and listen?" He turned to her, the faint lines at the corners of his eyes deepening as he smiled. "Maybe that's what it takes, for both land and people, to heal." She sipped her cider, eyes glinting. "And what about you? Have you healed, Mr. Realtor?" He looked toward the horizon where the creek bent toward the woods. "I stopped measuring worth in acres and started seeing it in heartbeats. That's enough healing for one lifetime." They sat quietly, watching the lights flicker across the water. From the hill behind the house, the music swelled into its final song, a slow, hopeful tune that made the night seem to hold its breath. Charlie rested his head on Richard's knee, content, his tail thumping once against the ground. As the crowd began to disperse, the park glowed softly in the aftermath, lanterns swinging, laughter fading, the scent of autumn lingering. Linda rose, brushing the grass from her skirt. "You should come inside soon," she said. "It's getting cold." "In a minute," Richard murmured. "You go ahead." He watched her walk back toward the house, the soft lantern light tracing her outline. Then he turned his gaze toward the dirt road beyond the gate, the same one Charlie always watched at dusk. Every evening, the dog would sit there, waiting for Richard to call him in from his rounds, as if both of them needed the ritual to know the day was done. That night was no different. As the last guests left and the wind grew still, Richard stood on the porch, calling softly, "Come on, boy." From down the path came the familiar sound of paws on stone, steady and sure. Charlie appeared, ears pricked, eyes bright with trust. The dog paused at the gate, glanced once toward the empty road, then trotted up the steps to his place by the door. Richard smiled. Good man. Inside, Linda was waiting by the fireplace, the soft glow reflecting in her eyes. She looked up as he entered, her expression a mix of joy and disbelief at how far they had come. You're late, she teased gently. Had to make sure our guardian made it home. She moved closer, her hand brushing against his. And what about you, Richard? He met her gaze, then leaned in, the moment stretching. Simple, inevitable, true. Their kiss was soft, unhurried, the kind that spoke not of passion, but of peace found after a long war. Outside, the wind stirred the roses, scattering a few petals across the porch. Later, as the fire burned low, Richard looked around the room, the old photographs, the restored beams, Charlie sleeping by the hearth, and felt something settle deep within him. Love, he realized, wasn't about ownership. It was about stewardship, about tending to what time gives you, and knowing when to let it breathe. Outside, the creek whispered on, its song carrying through the night, a lullaby for all things worth keeping. Sometimes the greatest miracles don't arrive with thunder or light. They come quietly, through loyalty, kindness, and a faithful heart that refuses to give up. Richard thought he had simply bought an old, broken house, but what he truly found was grace, the kind that only God can write into our lives when we learn to listen, forgive, and hold on to hope. Every creak of that wooden floor, every bark echoing through the night, was never coincidence. It was the Lord's gentle way of reminding us. Healing often hides beneath the dust of the past, waiting for a heart brave enough to uncover it. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes in second chances. Leave a comment about a time when faith guided you through life's storms, and don't forget to subscribe so more stories of hope and grace can find their way to your screen. May God bless you, your home, and the loyal souls who walk beside you, both two-legged and four-legged.